Well, hi there. So in this video, we're going to be going through the introduction to fiscal policy. We're going to talk about the different types of fiscal policy, show how they would change in aggregate demand and aggregate supply, and then finish with some of the issues using fiscal policy. So let's get started. Okay, so the first part up here just tells you about the two types of stabilization policy. And really, the goal of both types of stabilization policy is to help us smooth out that sine wave of the actual GDP, right? So the goal is to kind of smooth that out and make it a lot more like the potential GDP. Now, there are two ways that governments kind of typically pursue stabilizing the actual amount of output. And one of those would be using what we call fiscal policy. That would be changing spending, taxes, or transfers, right? These are the big three. And there are only three. And so we would say if you have fiscal policy, it just means that you're changing government spending, you're changing taxes, you're changing transfers in order to change output, in order to make output go up and fix a recession, or make output go down and fix an expansion. Now, the other type of stabilization policy we're going to look at is in Unit 8. It's called monetary policy. So for right now, if you see questions about monetary policy, at least you know that they're wrong. Now, let's talk about the different ways that economists classify fiscal policy. First is we would say, why are we doing it, right? First would be expansionary fiscal policy. This would be to increase output. It would make AD go up, right? That's the goal. And use in a recession, we would say, right? So we want to use expansionary policy to make output go up. We would use contractionary policy, that is to say aggregate demand go down, contract, get smaller, when we are in an expansion. And one of the reasons why I usually have questions about why do we want to use any kind of contractionary policy? Well, because if we were to allow the economy to self-adjust from being in an expansionary gap, as we learned in the last lecture, that self-adjustment will lead to higher price levels as SRAS shifts to the left with higher resource costs. And so sometimes governments will want to kind of pump the brakes a little bit on a really, really hot economy if we're producing beyond full employment. They'd say, let's slow things down a little bit, get us back to that potential level of output, right? So we kind of want to be at that potential level. Now, there are other ways that we classify these types of programs. We would say they're automatic policies, and then there are discretionary policies. And in short, automatic ones are ones where you have a pre-existing program or a law or a tax rate, and it basically works to smooth out that up and down without any intervention by the government at all. It's a government program or a government situation, but it's not like the Congress and the president have to pass a new law. So, for example, we would say that progressive income tax system is an example of a automatic stabilizer. So progressive taxes. And progressive taxes just means that higher income people pay more of their income in taxes, and lower income people would pay lower amounts, right? So progressive income taxes would be the same thing. And on both of these, right? Both contractionary and expansionary. And the reason why we would say that it works is that in really bad economic times, right? In a recession, people's incomes are lower, so they're going to pay less in taxes, and that would have the effect of increasing aggregate demand. It'll have the effect of boosting the economy. But when the economy is in an expansion, really high incomes, well, they're going to pay more in taxes, so they're automatically going to kind of pump the brakes on the economy during those periods. We would also say that kind of welfare payments or unemployment benefits, that's another good example of one. Unemployment benefits, any kind of welfare programs that are conditional upon your income, those are sometimes called means tested. Means tested programs means that when your incomes are really low, you qualify. When your incomes are high, you don't. So in bad economic times, more people would qualify for welfare, and that would boost aggregate demand. But in in really good economic times, in an expansion, we would say that fewer people would qualify for welfare, and so aggregate demand would actually fall as a result of fewer people getting welfare transfers. Now, then there are known as discretionary policies. These are ones where we've actually changed the law, right? We've have changes in taxes. What do we got? Spending and transfers. Those are the three types of discretionary policies that we're going to be dealing with, and we just summarized them as those fiscal policies. So whenever you get questions on exams, they may give you a multiple choice question or two about the automatic stabilizers, right? So these are called stabilizers. So if you sometimes see that attached to it. But discretionary ones are ones that they're going to ask you to generate. So for example, during a recession, what should we do? Well, we should cut taxes. Right here. Maybe during a recession, we should increase government spending, create some new programs. Maybe during an expansion, we should raise taxes. We should cut back on transfers, and we should cut back on government spending. So again, these are choices that get made. They're decisions that have to be made. So decisions, discretionary, choices, that's kind of another way to think about those. Now let's take a look at how these economies would actually get fixed from an expansion and a recession. So first, we're going to draw the economy in a recession and in an expansion, and then we're going to talk about how the government could actually address that. So when you go to draw the economy, I always suggest drawing SRAS and AD first, because that's going to tell you how much the economy is producing. And it says we're in a recession. So we know that the economy is below full employment. So I'm going to put my YF over to the right. Y1 is below full employment, and that's our LRAS. And now with an expansion, we're going to do the same thing, but on the other side. So we have an SRAS and an AD. That's going to tell us how much we are producing. And in an expansionary gap, we're producing above full employment. So we would say that LRAS should be over here at YF. And now I'll ask you, what should we do in a recession? Well, we could say 1, cut taxes. 2, increase government spending. 3, increase transfers. All 4 of those would do exactly the same thing. They would all increase aggregate demand. And so we shift the AD curve to the right. We're going to say to AD2, output goes back to full employment, and price levels go back to where they started. Now we would say, what would we do in an expansionary gap? Well, we're in an expansion. What should we do? We should raise taxes. Not very popular, right? Second, we should cut government spending. And third, we should cut transfers. None of those are particularly popular. Governments very often like to do fiscal corrections when we're talking about recessions, much less common over on this side. What would all 3 of these do? They would have the effect of reducing aggregate demand. So we're going to go to AD2, shift our output down, and it'll shift our price levels back to where they started again. Now, that's what they look like. What are maybe some of the issues with using it, right? We have time lags. First, it's just going to take time to actually implement policy. So this is really just different ways that it takes extra time. It can take years potentially to actually get that aggregate demand curve to move. And by the time you've done it, maybe it's too late. Second is that politicians are going to politic. Sometimes they're going to use the tools of fiscal policy. Excuse me. They're going to use the tools of cutting taxes, more spending, more transfers, even when we don't need to. Third, and this is a really important one, right? We want to put a star next to it. This one's called crowding out. We're going to return to it a few times, but this is our first introduction, so I'm going to try to keep it short and sweet. When governments often do, especially fixing from a recession, if we were to do cutting taxes and increasing government spending, either one of those, right? Or maybe both at the same time, aggregate demand is going to increase, sure. But when the government does that, they often have to borrow in order to do it, right? They're bringing in less money and they're spending more. When governments borrow, I want you to kind of envision like a buffet restaurant, right? And government walks in. Government's not like you and me in the buffet restaurant. Government is an 800-pound gorilla, and they just take it, take it, take it, take it, take it. Now, what they're actually getting at the buffet restaurant is borrowed money. Now, when that government borrows up all the money from the buffet, well, then there's less left for you and me. They're literally crowding us out. They're shoving us out of the way, right? Hence the name, crowding out. I'm going to put 800-pound gorilla. And if you don't know what that means, then you don't know what it means. And it's just like, get out of my way. I'm gonna borrow all this money. And when they borrow that money, it often actually causes interest rates to go up because there's more demand for borrowed money. As a result, there's going to be less investment spending, less consumption spending in the overall economy. So crowding out is really a reason why when they do pursue some of these fiscal policies, maybe aggregate demand is not going to rise as much as they might like. Another issue with crowding out policy is that if you're really crowding out, or with these crowding out effects, I should say, one of the issues with crowding out effects is if you're crowding out private investment, you could slow down growth rate, right? You could slow economic growth. And that's really one of the central goals of our whole class is that, right? So we kind of be careful with crowding out. And the last thing that we're going to know about using fiscal policy is related to crowding out. It's another reason why when the government does this stuff, they cut taxes, they increase spending, it's going to push prices up. Now, we're trying to recover from a recession. Those higher prices are going to make foreigners less likely to buy our goods and services. So instead of aggregate demand going all the way increasing, maybe it only increases just a little bit. That's true mostly in economies that are export oriented. But in short, it's the idea that as we try to fix aggregate demand going back up, we're actually kind of pushing against those higher prices. And foreigners are going to say, I don't want to buy as much. I don't want to buy as much. So that's another reason why maybe aggregate demand might not increase as much as we might think. So I'm going to combine these two and say reasons why we'd say AD might not increase as much as predicted. And that's kind of a good way to summarize these two particular issues is like we think aggregate demand is going to go up this much, but it doesn't quite do it. All right, so this gets you a good introduction to the use of fiscal policy for stabilization. We've got lots more to say about fiscal policy in this unit and in coming ones. I'll see you next time.